Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Stadium Stats. This week we'll be reviewing Week 4 of the NFL. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Thursday Night Football, we had a divisional matchup between the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers, and there was a theme this week. A lot of these games were very one-sided. This game started off with the Lions going into halftime, Lions up 27-3, and then the Packers started to come back and had unfortunately for them, were unsuccessful at coming back, and the Lions ended up winning 34-20. Jared Goff played all right. He had 19 of 28 for 200 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. But the real star of the show was David Montgomery, who had 30 carries for 120 yards and 3 touchdowns. Jahmyr Gibbs, their rookie running back, also played pretty well, 8 carries for 40 yards. And the receiving game was nothing too special. Josh Reynolds, 3 for 70. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 5 for 56 and a touchdown. And Sam Laporta had 4 for 56. Looking on defense, however, Jerry Jacobs did have 2 interceptions, and their defensive line looked incredible. They were sacking Jordan. There was so much pressure on Jordan Love. It seemed like the Green Bay Packers had arguably one of the worst offensive lines performances of the week, which, given the fact with the amount of injuries they had on their offensive line, it makes sense. But looking at the Lions, John Kaminsky had a sack, Alan McNeil had a sack, Aiden Hutchinson had a sack and a half, Charles Harris had half a sack, and Isaiah Buggs had a sack as well. Now for the Packers on offense, Jordan Love had 23 of 36 for 250 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. The running game never got going. Aaron Jones was hurt going into the game. Him and A.J. Dillon combined for 30 yards on 10 carries, 5 apiece. And then receiving-wise, Romeo Doubs looked really good, 9 for 95. Jaden Reed, their rookie receiver, also looked pretty good. He was 3 for 55, and no one else had more than 50 yards. But Christian Watson did have a touchdown in his first game back from injury this season. Defensively, I did say earlier they had an interception. Rudy Ford got an interception early in the game off Jared Goff. And then Devontae Wyatt had a sack, and Carl Brooks also had a sack. Moving on to the next game, which was our first London game of the year. First of 2 for Jacksonville, playing in London 2 weeks in a row. It was the Jacksonville Jaguars beat the Atlanta Falcons 23-7. Looking at the Falcons, Desmond Ridder was 19 of 31 for 200 yards, 1 touchdown to 2 interceptions. But the real star of the show, as we all know, is always their rushing game. And in this game, Bijan Robinson had 14 carries for 100 yards, 7.5 yards per carry. Receiving-wise, the big surprise was Jonnu Smith, their second-string tight end, had 6 receptions for almost 100 yards. Bijan Robinson was their second leading receiver with 5 for 30, and Drake London did have a receiving touchdown, but very few yards. Looking defensively, David Onyemata had a sack and a half, and Bud Dupree had half a sack. But the Jaguars actually were able to get going on offense this game for what felt like the second time this season. They hadn't looked like they could do much on offense since week 1. But Trevor Lawrence this week was 23 of 30, 200 yards and a touchdown. Their running game didn't look too good. Travis Etienne was 20 carries for 55 yards. That's less than 2 yards a carry. And Trevor Lawrence did have 8 rushes himself for 42 yards. But looking at the receiving game, Calvin Ridley had a really early touchdown. He was 2 for 38 and a touchdown. Christian Kirk looked amazing again, 8 for 84. And their tight end, Evan Engram, continues to impress, 7 for 59. Zay Jones was out for this game, which definitely hurt their passing offense potential, but they still looked really good. Darius Williams did have an interception, and so did Andre Sisco. And then Josh Allen had 3 sacks, and Trayvon Walker also had a sack himself. Next was the overtime game of the week. We have the Colts and the Rams. The Rams won in overtime 29-23. Matthew Stafford went 27 of 40 passing for 320 yards with a touchdown and an interception. Kyren Williams, he's still pretty new to being the starting running back, but he looked really good, 25 for 103 yards and 2 touchdowns. Receiving wise, Puka Nacua continues to impress. He has the most receptions for a receiver ever through 4 games. He also had 9 receptions in this game for 160 yards and a touchdown. He even had the game-winning touchdown in overtime. Tyler Higbee also looked pretty good, 5 for 64. And defensively, Ernest Jones, the fourth, had a sack. So did Aaron Donald, to no one's surprise. But looking at the Colts, Anthony Richardson played decent, 11 for 25 for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their running game was okay. Zach Moss was 18 for 70 for just under 4 yards a carry. And Anthony Richardson had 10 carries himself for 56 yards and a touchdown. Looking at the receiving game, Michael Pittman couldn't really get much going, only had 15 yards. Andrew Ogletree was actually their leading receiver with 3 for 48 and a touchdown. And Alec Pierce and Mo Alie-Cox both had a big grab each for around 35 yards. Looking defensively, Kenny Moore did have an interception off of Matthew Stafford, and Dayo Odeyingbo had a sack and a half. Up next, we have another divisional game. We got the Baltimore Ravens taking on the Cleveland Browns. The Baltimore Ravens won 28-3, which was honestly a big surprise because the Cleveland Browns had let up the fewest yards of any defense, and had been looking really good through 3 weeks. But Lamar Jackson had his way with their defense. He was 15 for 19 for almost 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their running game never really got going too well. Gus Edwards, 15 for 50, and Justice Hill, 3 for 33. Lamar also did have 9 carries for 30 yards and 2 touchdowns as well on the ground. Receiving-wise, Mark Andrews looked amazing, 5 for 80 and 2 touchdowns. Both of the receiving touchdowns in the game on their offense. Zay Flowers continues to impress in his rookie year, 3 for 56. And then looking defensively, yes, the Browns had started a rookie quarterback as Deshaun Watson was hurt. So it is no surprise that he struggled, but the Ravens defense really took advantage. Kyle Hamilton had an interception, Geno Stone had an interception, Brandon Steffens had an interception, and as well, Patrick Queen and Broderick Washington and Justin Madubuike all had a sack. Looking at the Browns offense, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, the rookie, first ever, his rookie debut, 19 for 36, 120 yards and 3 interceptions. Their running game never got going. Pierre Strong, 5 for 50, and Jerome Ford, 9 for 26. Dorian Thompson-Robinson did have a few rushing attempts himself, 4 for 24. And the receiving game never really got going that well either. David Njoku, the tight end, 6 for 46. And behind him, Elijah Moore, 2 for 20. Defensively, this was their worst showing yet on the year. They let up 28 points, which was definitely the most points they've let up so far. And they did have a few sacks. Bonnia Okoronkwo had a sack. Dalvin Tomlinson had half a sack. So did Jordan Elliott. And Myles Garrett also had a sack. Up next, we have the first of the 2 games between winless teams. Minnesota Vikings taking on the Carolina Panthers. The Minnesota Vikings came out of this one victorious, 21-13. They are now 1-3, and the Panthers move on to 0-4. Kirk Cousins had a pretty bad game, 12 for 19, 140 yards, 2 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. But Alexander Mattison did really get going on the ground with 17 for 95 yards. Cam Akers in his debut with the Vikings also had 5 carries for 40 yards. And just as always, Justin Jefferson was the star of the show on offense, in their passing offense. However, seeing as Kirk Cousins only threw for 140 yards, Justin Jefferson did have his worst performance yardage-wise, following up 3 150-yard games with 6 receptions for 85 yards and 2 touchdowns. TJ Hawkinson never really got going, and Jordan Addison didn't have a reception. But looking defensively, Harrison Smith continues to Harrison Smith had 3 sacks, and DJ Wonnum had 1. So did Marcus Davenport. And then looking at the Panthers' offense, Bryce Young was 25 of 32, 200 yards, didn't have a touchdown or an interception. Their running game never got going too well. Chuba Hubbard was the lead back this game, 14 for 41. Miles Sanders looked pedestrian out there, 13 for 19. But the receiving game looked pretty good. Adam Thielen had another big game, 7 for 76 yards. Terrace Marshall also looking pretty good, 9 for 56. Only 6 yards a catch, though. And then defensively, Sam Franklin Jr. had an interception. So did Camu Grugier-Hill. And then Yetur Gross-Matos had a sack, and so did Jeremy Chinn. Up next, we've got the Cincinnati Bengals taking on the Tennessee Titans, and this was a major upset. The Titans win 27-3. T. Higgins did get hurt during this game with fractured ribs. However, the Bengals continued to look really poor, even in his absence. Joe Burrow still hurt a little bit, but did play through the game, had 20 completions on 30 attempts for 160 yards. Joe Mixon, 14 carries for 67 yards, almost 5 yards a carry. He looked pretty good. And Jamar Chase continues to be their dominant receiver, 7 for 73. Tyler Boyd also looked okay, 4 for 26. And T. Higgins, before he got taken out of the game, did have 2 receptions. And then defensively, Sam Hubbard did have a sack. Trey Hendrickson had half a sack with B.J. Hill. And then Miles Murphy also had a sack. And Daxton Hill had an interception off of Ryan Tannehill, who, speaking of, Ryan Tannehill in this game was 18 for 25 for 240 yards, 1 touchdown and 1 interception. He started off this game really poor and started picking up the pace a little bit as he kept going. Derrick Henry looked amazing in this game, had a huge bounce-back game after a really poor effort last week. He was 22 for 122 and a touchdown. Tyjae Spears, his backup, a rookie, also looked really good. 5 carries for 40 yards, 8 yards a carry. And then receiving-wise, no surprise, DeAndre Hopkins was their leading receiver with 4 catches for 63 yards. And Nick Westbrook-Akine also looked pretty good. 5 catches, 50 yards, and a touchdown. Josh Weil also had a touchdown, and Chris Moore had 1 big grab for 44 yards. Defensively, they played really well. They held the Bengals to 3 points, and yes, Joe Burrow was hurt, and yes, T. Higgins was hurt. However, they kept putting pressure on the Bengals O-line. Jeffrey Simmons had a sack. Arden Key had a sack. Travis Gibson had a sack. And then they also were able, as I said earlier, to hold the Bengals to just 3 points the entire game, which, seeing as the Bengals have one of the most explosive offenses, is very impressive. Next was another divisional matchup between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the New Orleans Saints. Buccaneers come away with a win in this one, moving to 3-1. They won 26-9. Baker Mayfield, he played pretty well, 25 for 32, 250 yards and 3 touchdowns to 1 interception. Their running game never really got going too well. Rachaad White, just under 4 yards a carry, 15 for 56. Baker Mayfield also had 8 rushing attempts himself for 31 yards. And then receiving-wise, Mike Evans got taken out of this game with a hamstring injury. He had 3 catches for 40 yards at the time he left the game. Devin Tompkins had a touchdown, so did Cade Otton, and so did Trey Palmer. But the real star of the show was Chris Godwin with 8 catches for 114 yards. And then defensively, they had a really good performance. And yes, Derek Carr was hurt in this going into this game, as he had a shoulder injury. He had suffered a shoulder injury and had to be taken out of the game last week. But Antoine Winfield but they held the Saints to only 9 points, and a lot of that had to do with their with the pressure they were putting on, as Antoine Winfield had a sack, and Vita Vea had 2, and Dee Delaney also did have an interception. Looking at the Saints, they never really got much going. Alvin Kamara returned from his suspension. He was 11 carries for 50 yards, almost around 4.5 yards a carry. He played pretty well in his return, but Derek Carr didn't look very good. 23 completions on 37 attempts for 130 yards. Jameis Winston also came in for 1 pass and threw an interception, and Taysom Hill also came in for a pass and threw a completion. And then looking at their receiving game, Alvin Kamara had 13 receptions, but only 33 yards. That's only 2.5 yards a catch, which is really, really low. And then the only 2 other players who even had multiple catches were Rashid Shaheed with 3 for 33 and Michael Thomas with 4 for 53. Chris Olave only had one catch in this game and only had 4 yards. And then defensively, Isaac Yiadom had one interception, and Brian Bresee had 1 sack. Up next, we had what everyone thought would be the game of the week, but it ended up being a very one-sided battle as the Miami Dolphins fell to the Buffalo Bills 20-48. Both of these teams are now 3-1. Tua played all right, 25 of 35 for almost 300 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. The real star of the show was Devon Achane yet again, had another 2 rushing touchdowns, 12.5 yards a carry again after his 20 yards a carry performance last week. He was 8 for 101 yards. Raheem Mostert didn't look very good after his amazing performance last week, 7 carries for 9 yards this week. And then receiving wise, they didn't get going nearly as much as the Dolphins normally do. Tyreek Hill had 3 catches for 58 yards. Jalen Waddle, 4 for 46. Braxton Berrios, 6 for 43 and a touchdown. And Durham Smythe had 4 for 41. And then defensively, they could not stop the Bills. They really just couldn't. The Bills put up 48 points on them. Andrew Van Ginkel did have 2 sacks, but nothing else of note on defense. The Dolphins' defense really played poorly today, as Josh Allen threw for them 21 for 25 for 320 yards and 4 touchdowns to no interceptions. The run game never really got going, though. I will say the Dolphins' run defense played pretty well. Latavius Murray, 4 carries for 32 yards, and James Cook, 12 for 29 and a touchdown. Josh Allen also did have a rushing touchdown as well. But the real star of their offensive performance was Stephon Diggs, who had 6 receptions for 120 yards and 3 touchdowns. He had 3 touchdowns. Then there was Gabe Davis, who had 3 catches for 60 yards and another touchdown. And James Cook had 1 major catch for 48 yards as well. Their rookie tight end, Dalton Kincaid, got going, 4 for 27. And then defensively, they held a team who last week put up 70 points. They held them to 20. Micah Hyde had an interception. Unfortunately, did go down with a very bad injury, had to get carted off the field. Greg Rousseau had 2 sacks, though. Ed Oliver had a sack. Daquan Jones had a sack. Their defense played really well, and I was really impressed to see the Dolphins get held to only 20 points after a 70-point performance last week. Up next was the other game between 2 teams who have yet to win a game, the Denver Broncos and the Chicago Bears. And going into halftime, this seemed like the Bears had the game locked up. The Broncos were down 21-7. And coming out of halftime, the Bears scored yet again and were up 28-7. And then the Broncos scored 24 unanswered points in response to the Bears' 28 unanswered points to eventually win. Justin Fields was given a chance to have one final drive, down 3, and threw an interception on the drive. But looking at the individual stats, Russell Wilson had a pretty good game, 75% completion percentage, 21 of 28 for 220 yards and 3 touchdowns. Jaleel McLaughlin was easily their best rusher, as he was 7 for 72. No one else could get going at all, though. And then looking at the receiving game, they didn't play too spectacular, but Jerry Jeudy, 3 catches for 50 yards. Marvin Mims, 2 catches for 50 yards. Jaleel McLaughlin also had 3 for 30, and Cortland Sutton also had 3 for 30. And then defensively, Kareem Jackson did have the game-winning interception off of Justin Fields, and Nick Bonito did have 2.5 sacks. Zach Allen had half a sack, and Jonathan Cooper had a sack as well. Looking at the Bears, though, Justin Fields definitely had the best passing performance he's had in his entire career. 28 of 35 for 330 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception. This was a major bounce-back game for him and the entire Bears offense. However, the Bears defense continues to play horrifically and cost them games. But it was nice to see Justin Fields finally play well. The rushing game also finally looked good, as Khalil Herbert had 18 carries for 100 yards, almost 6 yards a carry. Justin Fields also had 4 carries himself for 25 yards. And receiving-wise, DJ Moore, the guy who they traded for in the offseason, looked amazing. He was 8 for 130 yards and a touchdown. As well as Cole Kmet, who also looked amazing, got a big contract extension in the offseason. He had 7 catches for 85 yards and 2 touchdowns. Darnell Mooney also got going, 4 for 51. Their passing game looked really good. Justin Fields was really efficient and had very few incompletions. And then defensively, they looked really poor. Zach Pickens and Dominique Robinson did both have half a sack, but they did not make up for the 30 points that they let up to the Broncos. Up next, we have another divisional matchup. There were a lot of divisional matchups this week, and this game was arguably the most exciting game of the week. It was the Washington Commanders versus the Philadelphia Eagles. This game also went to overtime as the Commanders fell to the Eagles 31-34. Looking at the Commanders' offense, Sam Howell played pretty well, 29 for 41, 290 yards and a touchdown. Brian Robinson is the very clear lead back in this backfield. He had 14 carries for 45 yards and a touchdown. Sam Howell also did rush 6 times for 40 yards, and Antonio Gibson 6 for 19. And then the receiving game did actually look pretty good this week. Terry McLaurin had 8 catches for 86 yards, Curtis Samuel had 7 for 51, and Jahan Dotson had 4 catches for 27 yards and a touchdown, of which that touchdown was scored right as time expired to tie the game and bring it into overtime. And then looking at the Commanders' defense, Cameron Curl did have a sack, so did Jonathan Allen and Chase Young. That D-line continues to look really good, especially even against a really dominant O-line like the Philadelphia Eagles have. And then looking at the Eagles on offense, Jalen Hurts had a really nice game, 25 for 37 for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. DeAndre Swift looked pretty good again, 3 weeks in a row of him being the clear lead back, 14 for 56 and a touchdown. But the real star of the Eagles offense was A.J. Brown with a monstrous game, 9 catches, 175 yards and 2 touchdowns. Devontae Smith also looked really good, 7 catches for 78 yards. And then looking at their defense, Nicholas Morrow had 3 sacks, and Josh Sweat had a sack. Hassan Reddick also had a sack. And then looking at the final game of the 12 o'clock window, we've got the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Houston Texans. And the Houston Texans had a very dominant win. First dominant win for the Texans in a very long time, as they won 30-6. Kenny Pickett was 15 for 23 for 114 yards and an interception. He did suffer an injury, and Mitch Trubisky took over, 3 for 5 for 18 yards. Najee Harris had a nice bounce-back game, as he's been playing really poorly all season, but he did have 14 carries for 70 yards, 5 yards a carry in this game. Jaylen Warren also played pretty nice, 8 carries for 29 yards. And the receiving game never really got going too well. Najee Harris had 1 big catch for 30 yards. Jaylen Warren, 6 catches for 25 yards. And George Pickens, 3 for 25. Calvin Austin also had 3 for 25. And their defense played really poorly, as they were up against a rookie quarterback in C.J. Stroud, who, yes, has played really well. But this Texans offense is limited. They do not have a ton of skill, but they looked really good. The Steelers had no sacks, no interceptions. C.J. Stroud played really well, 16 completions on 30 passing attempts for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. Looking at the rushing game, Dameon Pierce was 24 for 81, 3.5 yards a carry, and Devin Singletary, 7 for 25, also 3.5 yards a carry. Nico Collins had a breakout game, 7 receptions, 170 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Dalton Schultz also looked really nice. They paid him a lot of money in the offseason to be their dominant receiving tight end, who had 3 receptions for 42 yards and a touchdown. And then looking at their defense, they played really well. They held the Steelers to only 6 points, and it was unfortunate that Kenny Pickett got taken out of the game, but they had plenty of chances to score points, and the Texans' defense really held them. Jonathan Greenard had 2 sacks. Steven Nelson had an interception. Jerry Hughes had a sack. And the Texans' defense, all in all, looked really good. The Texans as a whole team looked really good this week. Up next, we've got the first of the 3 o'clock window games. It was another divisional matchup between the Raiders and the Chargers. The Chargers came out with a win, 24-17. They are now 2-2 to the Raiders, 1-3. Aiden O'Connell was starting in this game. He was a 5th-round rookie. Jimmy Garoppolo has a concussion. So there wasn't high expectations for the Raiders, but Aiden O'Connell did exceptionally poorly. He was 24 of 39, 240 yards, no touchdowns, with 1 interception and multiple fumbles. The running game never really got going. Josh Jacobs, 17 for 58 and a touchdown. And Aiden O'Connell did also have a rushing touchdown. But the real reason that they even put up points was all in their passing game. Josh Jacobs was 8 for 81, and Davante Adams was 8 for 75. Davante Adams did get hurt in the middle of the game, but came back and was and played incredibly well for them. And then defensively, yeah, they let up a lot of points. They let up 24 points in the first half, but the Chargers didn't do anything in the second half. They did have Max Crosby with 2 sacks, and Trevon Moehrig Woodard had an interception. And then looking at the Chargers, Justin Herbert, he started off the game playing incredibly well, and in the first half was nearly unstoppable. But he ended the game 13 of 24 for 170 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. He did rush 12 times for 27 yards and 2 touchdowns, though. And then Austin Eckler was out for this game, so Joshua Kelly was the lead back, and he played fine, 17 for 65. But receiving-wise, Keenan Allen had 3 for 32 and a touchdown, and Joshua Palmer had 3 for 77. But they really seem to be missing Mike Williams, who is out with a torn ACL for the season. Defensively, Asante Samuel did have an interception, and the big star of the show was Khalil Mack, who had 6 sacks all by himself. Overall, their defense did play pretty well, seeing as they only let up 17 points, and they did force multiple fumbles and an interception, and had 6 sacks, but it was all from Khalil Mack. Up next was the Cardinals-San Francisco 49ers game, and to no one's surprise, the 49ers won 35-16. Joshua Dobbs did play pretty well, 28 of 41 for 265 yards and 2 touchdowns. Rushing-wise, James Conner played pretty well, 11 for 52, and Josh Dobbs did have 12 for 48 as well. And then receiving-wise, Marquise Brown played really well, 7 for 96. Michael Wilson had a really big game, 7 for 76, and his first 2 career touchdowns. And then Zach Ertz also played pretty well with 6 for 53. And defensively, they looked about as you'd expect against the 49ers offense. They did have 1 sack. Dennis Gardeck had a sack. But looking at the 49ers, Brock Purdy had a near flawless game, 20 for 21, 283 yards and a touchdown. Christian McCaffrey had an incredible game, 20 carries for 106 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns, as well as 7 receptions for 71 yards and another touchdown. I think he is now the first player since he is one of the first players since the 1960s to have 100+ yards and a touchdown in first of 4 games of a season. He is on a record-setting pace right now. And then Brandon Ayuk also played really well, 6 for 148. And then their defense looked really good. Javon Hargrave had a sack, and they held the Cardinals to 16 points after they put up a considerable amount of points against a Cowboys defense that we all thought was really good. Speaking of the Cowboys, the other 3 o'clock window game was the Cowboys-Patriots, and this was a complete blowout. The Cowboys won 38-3. Mac Jones looked really bad, 12 for 21, 150 yards and 2 interceptions. Bailey Zappi even came in, 4 for 9 and 57 yards. And then rushing-wise, they also looked really poor. Ramondre Stevenson, 14 carries for 30 yards, only 2 yards a carry. Ezekiel Elliott, 6 for 16, less than 3 yards a carry as well. Receiving, they only had 1 receiver with over 50 yards. Hunter Henry had 4 catches for 51 yards. And everyone else had 2 or less catches and 45 or less yards. They just never got going anything on offense. Then they only scored 3 points the whole game. And their defense, which New England is known for having really good defenses historically, they let up 38 points to the Cowboys. Although a lot of those points were scored by the Cowboys defense, but they still let up a lot of points to the Cowboys. Defensively, though, they did get a couple sacks. Jelani Tavai had a sack, Deatrich Wise had a sack, and Josh Uche had a sack. And then looking at the Cowboys, Dak Prescott played really well, 28 for 34, 260 yards and a touchdown. And then Tony Pollard had a decent game, 11 carries for 47 yards. And Kevontae Turpin came in clutch with a really big carry, 1 for 46. And then looking at the receiving, Jake Ferguson, 7 for 77. Michael Gallup, 5 for 60. And Jalen Tolbert, 4 for 53. And then looking at the Cowboys' defense, this is where they really shined, as Deron Bland had 2 interceptions, as well as one of them being a pick six. And then Sam Williams had a sack, and Dante Fowler also had a sack. Unfortunately, Micah Parsons, the star of that defense, did get hurt today and was out for the game, which is really unfortunate since they just lost Trayvon Diggs for the entire season, their other star on defense. And then looking at our Sunday night football game, this was a really close one, a lot closer than you would have expected for a matchup between Patrick Mahomes and Zach Wilson, as the Chiefs only won 23-20. Patrick Mahomes actually did get out-dueled by Zach Wilson, as Patrick Mahomes was 18 for 30 for 200 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. But the real star of their offense today was Isaiah Pacheco, who had a career day, 20 carries, 115 yards, and a touchdown, almost 6 yards a carry. Receiving-wise, Travis Kelce, the star of the show, 6 for 60. Isaiah Pacheco also looked really good, 3 for 43, and Noah Gray had a big touchdown catch for 34 yards. And their defense looked, honestly, not very good, given how poor Zach Wilson has looked for a majority of his career. They let up 20 points to Zach Wilson. He looked really good and outdueled Mahomes. They did have a couple sacks, as Mike Edwards had a sack and Chris Jones had a sack. But other than that, their defense looked a lot worse than you would have thought, as Zach Wilson was 28 of 39 for 245 yards and 2 touchdowns. They also let up 56 yards on 6 carries to Breece Hall for an average of 9.3 yards per carry. Dalvin Cook does continue to struggle, though, as he was only 5 for 16 at 3 yards a carry. And then receiving-wise, they had a few good receivers. Allen Lazard, 3 for 61 and a touchdown. Garrett Wilson also looked really good, 9 for 60. And Tyler Conklin was 4 for 58. And then defensively, as I said earlier, Patrick Mahomes did have 2 interceptions, one of which was to Ashton Davis and the other to C.J. Mosley. And then Quinnen Williams and Quentin Jefferson had a half sack each. And then looking at our last game, the Monday Night Football game, was the Seattle Seahawks versus the New York Giants, of which the Seahawks destroyed 24-3. Geno Smith had an all-right game, 13 for 20 for 100 yards and a touchdown. Andrew Luck also came in for a couple plays, 2 on 6 attempts for 63 yards. The running game did look really good again, as Kenneth Walker had 17 carries for 79 yards and another touchdown. And Zach Charbonnet also had 30 rushing yards. And the receiving game looked fine at best. Noah Fant was their leading receiver, 2 for 60. And Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf each had a couple catches. Tyler Lockett with 54 yards, DK Metcalf with 34 and a touchdown. But the real reason the Seahawks won by this much was because they had 11 sacks. Bobby Wagner had 2, Devin Witherspoon had 2, Jordan Brooks had 2, Uchenna Nwosu had 2, Mario Edwards had 1, Miles Adams had 1, and Boye Mafe had 1. And in addition, Devin Witherspoon and Quandre Diggs both had an interception. They played incredible defense. They held the Giants to 3 points, and 11 sacks is just ridiculous. And then looking at the Giants, they couldn't get much of anything going. Again, they only scored 3 points. They got sacked 11 times. That really doesn't help. They also were missing Saquon Barkley again. But Daniel Jones was 27 of 34 for 200 yards and 2 interceptions. He also did rush 10 times for 66 yards. And Matt Breida was their lead running back at 14 carries for 30 yards. And then they really spread the ball around to their receivers. Matt Breida, 5 catches for 48 yards. Wan'Dale Robinson, 5 for 40. And no one else even passed 25 yards. But there were a ton of guys on the team who had receptions, as Daniel Jones did have 27 completions. And the leading receiver only had 5 catches. And then defensively, they played fine. Kayvon Thibodeau played really well. He had 2 sacks, but they did lose this game on offense. Their defense was not the problem here. Getting into the power rankings, At number 10 this week, I've got the Houston Texans, which is a big surprise. Was not expecting them to play very well, and they actually came out with a huge win, second really big win in a row, and they're just looking much improved, 2-2, already almost tying their win total of last year of 3 wins. They're looking really good. CJ Stroud continues to play really well. He's got the most amount of passes by a rookie quarterback without an interception in NFL history. He has a bunch of 300-yard games already. He looks amazing, and that Texans offense is firing. The Texans defense looks pretty good as well, as they held the Steelers to only 6 points the whole game. Going into the number 9 spot, I've got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They are now 3-1. They've continued to look way better than any team or than anybody thought they would be in this going into the season. They put up a lot of points. They put up a really good fight against the New Orleans Saints, as the Saints only had 9 points to the Bucs 26. Baker Mayfield impressing a lot of people with his play. He's been playing a lot better than anyone expected going into the season. Number 8, I've got the Dallas Cowboys. They did lose last week, to the Cardinals, who everyone thought was going to be the worst team in football, so that really did take them down a little bit. But the rest of the weeks, they've looked dominant. Their defense, yet again, had 2 pick sixes this week. Their defense continues to look really dominant, but their offense is a little shaky, as Dak is turnover prone, as he proved last week. But this week, he did a lot better, and the whole team played amazing. 38 points on a Bill Belichick team, only let up 3 points. Their defense looks dominant. But speaking of dominant defenses, at number 7, I've got the Seattle Seahawks, who had 11 sacks against the Giants on Monday Night Football, which is a crazy amount of sacks. Their defense looks amazing. Their passing game, under most circumstances, looks really good, although it didn't look that great this week. But their running game has been one of the most dominant in the league so far, as Kenneth Walker has 4 touchdowns in the season. And overall, this team is really balanced and looks really good. And at number 6, I've got the Miami Dolphins. Really rough loss this week to the Bills, but the Bills are a very good team. You can't forget that the Dolphins did put up 70 points last week. Their offense looks so explosive. Devon Achane continues to look amazing as their rookie running back, and I can't wait to see him be used more. But they really did show some vulnerability this week, as their passing game was definitely stopped by the Bills' defense. But I can't wait to see them bounce back, as I believe they will next week. At number 5, I've got the Baltimore Ravens. They are 3-1 and have looked dominant in all 3 of their wins. Lamar Jackson is playing really well. They've got weapons this year for him to be surrounded by. Zay Flowers, their rookie receiver, looks really good continuously. And Mark Andrews, of course, one of the best tight ends in the game. But the real side of the ball they shine on is defense, and their defense has looked spectacular this year. At number 4, I've got the Detroit Lions. They beat the Chiefs in week 1, really proved that they were going to be a team to be reckoned with. Week 2, had a rough loss to the Seahawks, but came back and had a massive win last week against the Falcons. And this week, had another major win against the Packers. They've looked dominant in each of their last 2 weeks. Their offense is firing on all cylinders. David Montgomery has had some incredible games, tons of touchdowns. And their defense has looked so far improved from what it was last year, which isn't saying much since their defense was really poor last year, but their defense actually looks really good this year. Brian Branch, their rookie safety, looks amazing, and they just look like a complete football team. But in at number 3, I've got the Buffalo Bills. They have now had 3 weeks in a row of just dominant wins. They lost week 1 to the New York Jets in a game that Josh Allen looked really, really poor. But the 3 weeks since, they destroyed the Raiders and then Last week, they destroyed the Commanders. Their defense had 4 interceptions. And then this week, they destroyed the Dolphins, the team that I had put at my number 1 spot last week, a team that I think a lot of people had really high expectations for, and a lot of people thought were going to beat the Bills. But Josh Allen played incredible yet again. They put up 48 points, and they held that Bills passing offense and the entire offense as a whole to only 20 points. But coming in at number 2, I've got, it's between the 2 remaining undefeated teams. And at number 2, I do have the Philadelphia Eagles, as they have looked less dominant than the 49ers, but still very dominant, especially as of recent. A.J. Brown finally has been getting going lately, and overall, their defense is seeming to get a lot better than it was in the beginning of the season when they were letting up a bunch of points to the Patriots. They continue to score a ton of touchdowns with the, as they call it, tush push, where Jalen Hurts sneaks in for a touchdown while he gets pushed by their center, Jason Kelce. And overall, this team looks really good. One of the only 2 undefeated teams, but the Niners look better. The 49ers are my number 1. Brock Purdy, 21 of 22, near perfect game. He had over 200 yards. He had a touchdown, and Christian McCaffrey had 4 touchdowns. He's the leading rusher in the entire league. Deebo Samuel was hurt this week, but he has shown in the past couple weeks how great he can be. And Brandon Ayuk was hurt in the past couple weeks, but he showed in weeks 1 and today just how good he can be, and that either of them in any given week can be the number 1 receiver that this team needs. And the other one can always back them up, but one of them has been dominant in every single game. And that's not even going without mentioning George Kittle, one of the most dynamic tight weapons in the game, really, really useful in the blocking game. Hasn't really been used as much as I think a lot of people would have expected in the passing game this year. He's kind of been underwhelming in that department, but one of the most dominant pass blocking tight ends of all time. And this defense continues to be one of the best units in the league. Continues to be especially in the running department. They really do not let up a ton of rushing yards, and this defense looks dominant. The 49ers look like one of the most well-rounded teams, and that's why they come in at my number 1 spot. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.